recent and ongoing restoration work at Roy's Redwoods, which is very impressive. I was happy to join a guided tour there a couple of months ago. So Jon Campo and Julian Geoghegan are our presenters, and they will each be giving their own respective Zoom programs, contributions. And Jon is the Principal Natural Resources Planner at Marin County Parks. His approach to the role is defined by a staunch commitment to preserving our sensitive natural and cultural resources. He places a particular emphasis on the thoughtful and careful planning of public trails, recognizing it as an integral component in the overarching goal of safeguarding these invaluable assets. And Julian Geoghegan is the vegetation specialist with Marin County Parks, where he started working in 2017. His work focuses on invasive species management and rare plant conservation in the county's parks and open space preserves. While botany has proven to be his professional calling, in the past he has worked trails in the Klamath National Forest and monitored wildlife for East Bay Regional Parks. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a concentration in ecology and conservation biology. And we request that you stay muted during the actual program and put any questions that you have in the chat or hold them for in-person Q&A at the end of the program. So please welcome Jon and Julian.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Appreciate the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And Kristen, if you could let me know when you see it.
I see it. You might want to enlarge it.
Is that full screen?
Not quite. It might be as big as it gets. It's square. It's not rectangular, but
okay. I think it's
I'm not seeing any extraneous text.
Yeah, it's full screen on my side.
I think it's good.
It's rectangular to me on mine.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
The way it looks on my
I think it's
screen.
okay.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, folks. Yeah, like Kristen said, my name is Jon Campo. I'm the Principal Natural Resources Planner with Marin County Parks. And I want to talk to you tonight about the Roy's Redwoods Restoration Project. This was a really exciting project that we are essentially completed. We're still revegetating the site, but the big construction is done. And so this was a joint project with Marin County Parks and the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. So we led this project, and we are two of the 5 agencies that make up one TAM. And so this was actually the first one TAM project to be implemented. So that was exciting in itself. One TAM's been around for about 10 years, and this is the first project we've completed. Just to introduce you to some of the other members of the team, we had a fantastic team, which I attribute our success to. We had PCI Ecological, and they were working on the hydrologic restoration for this project. Restoration Design Group in Roth Lamont was two local folks. They live in Fairfax, and so that was very convenient, close to the site. They worked on the public access design. And then Hanford Arc was the contractor that built the project. I think most folks know where Roy's Redwoods is, but just to orient, so Roy's Redwoods is a 293-acre preserve in the San Geronimo Valley, so kind of out towards West Marin, just adjacent to the former golf course. And within that preserve, our project site was in this red circle here. It really focused on the old growth redwood forest, in addition to the meadow, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So why did we engage in this project? If you had been to Roy's Redwoods in the past, you may have acknowledged that it was maybe overloved, loved to death. Some words I've heard talked about this site. It attracted a fraction of the visitors that Muir Woods, but it's had significantly more environmental impacts due to the unregulated visitation. The site never really had any defined planned trail system. So as a result, folks just wandered across the site, unknowing of the damage that was actually being caused. So much of the understory was void of vegetation and the ground was really compacted. The creek, this is Larson Creek here, and the creek would dry up in the summer, which then would turn into a trail and people would use that for access. That created a lot of stream bank erosion and down cutting. So there was numerous reasons for us to want to get into a restoration project here. This is I really just kind of wanted to illustrate our project history. This project was first identified in 2016. And then over the next almost 10 years, we had a series of milestones from conceptual designs to the environmental review and permitting, grant funding. And we began the implementation in 2023. And then we just completed the implementation in November of 2024. And since that point, we've been revegetating the site and stewarding the site. And so to really begin our process, we took a deep dive into the site analysis. We really wanted to understand what was there. So we learned about the vegetation community with one-time BioBlitzes. Shelley Benson had done a vegetation assessment. And we continued to study the wildlife of the site. We have over 20 years of monitoring data for northern spotted owls, which have been breeding in the area for a long time. We learned more about some of the other iconic wildlife, such as the Pacific giant salamander. This is a great photo. It's eating a banana slug on site. And we also looked at the hydrology. What was going on with Larson Creek? There was a lot of down cutting, incision, and why was that happening and how could we address it? We mapped the social trails. So this is Nicasio Valley Road here. And so this colored polygon area, this is all the project area. And you really can't fit any more social trails in there. There was trails everywhere, going every which way. So in these orange polygons or salmon colored, those are heavily impacted areas. So where the ground was just like concrete. And we did a visitor use survey. So, I mean, with this, it gave us the obvious answer of why people were going. Everybody wanted to go see the redwood trees. After all, this is one of 4 old growth redwood sites in Marin. Muir Woods, Samuel P. Taylor, Roy's Redwoods, and then down the steep ravine trail, there's an old growth grove. So there's only 4. So this is a very popular site for that. And then we also wanted to know where people were going specifically. So we figured out what were the attractions in this site, why were people going to the places they were going, and that helped us plan out the public access. And we talked to the local school groups. Lagunitas Elementary School has been going to Roy's Redwoods probably since the 70s, since this was acquired as a public open space. And not only the elementary school, but also preschool groups and outdoor education groups. So outdoor education at Roy's Redwoods has been a long honored tradition for many, many decades, really. And we had numerous public meetings. We had them on site and we had them at the community center in San Geronimo Valley. And we invited, all the environmental groups, community members, community groups, regulatory agencies, anybody that wanted to share an opinion about Roy's, we wanted to hear it. We wanted to learn as much as we could from locals and from regulatory agencies, and that would help shape the process and the goals. And so from all those conversations, we came up with 4 goals to really guide the work. Restore and enhance the hydrologic function of Larson Creek. And so Larson Creek actually flows into San Geronimo Creek, and San Geronimo Creek flows into Lagunitas Creek. And those 2 creeks are very important salmonid streams. Salmon don't go up to Roy's Redwoods, but the water going downstream and the sediments does go to those lower streams, which does affect those populations. We wanted to restore and enhance the health of the redwood forest in the understory. We wanted to develop an accessible trail for all visitors. That's not something we had done before in Marin County, on the Marin County Parks lands. And so we wanted to plan that as well. And finally, continue to maintain an immersive experience. We had heard from the community that they didn't, now I say this in the most loving terms for Muir Woods, but folks didn't want another Muir Woods. They didn't want it to be quite as curated or quite as fenced off. And so this was a big task for us. How do we thread that needle, make it immersive, but also protect the site and really try and encourage people to stay on trails and not wander off trail. So that was a big challenge, and I think we did pretty well. I have some photos to show you. So the first goal, restoring and enhancing the hydrologic process. So this is a pre-project photo of Larson Creek through the site. And so I would point out in this photo, we're looking at a creek channel that's incised, so it's down cut. And during storm events, water comes through this system and moves pretty quickly. And this creek, during those events, is disconnected from the floodplain. So all the water pretty much stays in the channel here. It doesn't spill over, kind of saturate the floodplain. And that's not something we wanted for the restoration. We wanted to slow spread and sink the water on site. So I like this graphic I found. The tiles on the left kind of show a simplified channelized creek. And in this slide, there's beavers that are building dams, and they are making the stream more complex and slowing the water down and to the right. And so we went from an incised stream to a kind of a restored stream. And you also see this graphic here at the water table. On this site, the water table is much lower down. On this one, we've slowed spread this, sink the water, keep it on site, and recharge the local site to make that water available for the redwood trees. So we didn't bring beavers to Roy's Redwoods, but we brought in a lot of logs. And so this is a photo from Kent Lake, which is one of the MMWD reservoirs, just really across the street. It's not far from Roy's. And in this reservoir, over the years, many redwood trees have fallen in, and the water district fishes them out and has staged them off to the side. And they've been sitting there for a long time. And we were able to have an agreement with MMWD where they would donate dozens of redwood logs for this restoration project. We didn't know it at the time, and I'm not sure they did, but some of these logs turned out to be over 1,000 years old. So it was amazing wood, an amazing resource. And so this is a photo of over 150 logs that we staged in the meadow. This was the staging area for the site. These logs were used for, like I said, the hydrologic restoration, also for some of the public access, and some of the, the trail edging and all different facets. The redwood logs was a very big and complex part of this project. Every single log was tagged with an arborist tag, was measured, the length, the diameter, and we had them all on a spreadsheet, and everyone had a very specific location where it went. So it's actually a pretty cool process. This is one of those logs being buried in the creek channel. And the final resting position of this log is a little bit raised up. And again, it's to slow the water down, spread it out, and sink it. And most visitors that go there today, I'm assuming, don't even realize like how much of this project was actually hydrologic restoration. Over 80 logs were very strategically placed to deflect and spread the water out. And so this is a good before and after of that. So the top photo, there's David Herlocker. I'm sure many of you know him. This is a photo of the incised creek channel, and below is the restored creek channel. And so this is it's an academic term known as stage 0 restoration. And that essentially means to reconnect the creek to the floodplain, to remove that incision. And in this case, we filled it in with native soils and gravels. And then we added these logs to deflect and slow the water down and bump it around. This was also the first stage 0 restoration project in Marin. So that was kind of another thing that we're proud of. And another goal was to develop an accessible trail for visitors. Again, this is the first time in Marin County that we've done this in one of our Marin County Park preserves. We've planned it. We have a inclusive access plan that talks about it and talked about Roy's Redwoods. And so this was a long time coming. And so these trails will allow folks that have any kind of mobility challenges, they're in a wheelchair, or they need some assistance. The trails are firm and stable, and they have a very gentle cross slope and gentle running grades. And so they're accessible. And even in the winter months, these trails will stay firm and stable, and you'll be able to access it. So some of you may know Nona Dennis right there. And there's about a half-mile of accessible trail at the site. So sometimes you see these accessible trails and they take you just outside the parking lot. They don't really get you into the essence of the forest. And we really wanted to make sure that folks could get into the redwood forest and get to experience that. And so this is one of the larger boardwalks out there. It's a 200-foot long boardwalk, and this is all accessible. And some of the neat features of this, if you notice the edging, this toe kick, it's a live edge. And some people might look at that and say, well, why did you use that rotten wood? This is all old growth redwood. Some of this is 1,000-year-old redwood from those logs at Kent Lake. And so we thought it would add a nice character, and it's extremely durable. It'll last a very long time. Another aspect of this boardwalk, the designers, they wanted to kind of play off the forest. And so this, with the staggered boardwalk, was to mirror an image of falling trees, one falling on top of another. And ironically, 3 weeks after we built this, a redwood tree fell on it. And so that was a bit of a shock. So this was a very large redwood tree that fell on it, and we managed to figure out a way to incorporate this tree into the repair. So the tree that broke the boardwalk actually fixed the boardwalk. So we had a great team. We milled up some slabs from this tree, milled up the new replacement stringers, and we had it fixed within about 3 weeks. And I think we were trying to figure out a way to tell this story. So if you went back here 5 years from now and you didn't know exactly what happened, this boardwalk plank came from that redwood tree, and we drew a string line from the top of this to the other end. And so this angle matches this tree perfectly. And so you kind of might be able to look at that and kind of piece together what the story was and what happened there. So that was kind of I thought it was a creative way to repair that issue. There's other beautiful elements to the craftsmanship. This photo on the left, the stone staircase coming off the road. These are all hand-cut stone. The guys chiseled out each stone and mortared them into place, and I think it's just absolutely beautiful. And there was nice details on the accessible boardwalks, and all the bridges have these stone thresholds, which are also very nice. If you go further up on the site, we're outside the forest, but still within this project area. And we were all just so impressed that we didn't know we had that ability to do that. It's, again, another nice feature that'll last many years. We've since hired him full time. We were like, okay, we're not letting him go. So another goal is to maintain that immersive experience in the redwood forest. And so how do we create that and maintain that playfulness of Roy's Redwoods, but foundationally protecting the site for future generations. It has to continue to do that. So again, we thought about ways to use those redwood logs, and I should just point out, no trees were harvested from Roy's Redwoods. These were all salvaged logs. They were from Kent Lake, some were from PG&E sites, some were from flood control sites. We had logs donated to us, but no trees. We didn't fall any trees in Roy's Redwoods or anywhere intentionally to get this lumber. It's all salvaged. So some of those logs were used for this public access. And so this plank system here, there's extensive planks that go through the floodplain, and that trail is known as Wilderness Way. Another little fun tidbit with that's a nod to Gene Berensmeyer, who was involved in this project. And Gene had a outdoor education school called Wilderness Way. And so we thought it would be fitting to name this trail after Gene's efforts. This is a great photo that Julian actually took. So this is on Wilderness Way. And so this shows a couple of things. Like, one, how fun is it to walk through this floodplain across these planks? These planks are all bolted down so that they don't move and they're stable. And this was a high flow. So even in the highest flows, you could still walk through this area. But it also shows the slow it, spread it, sink it. This is not a defined creek channel anymore. This is spreading out across the forest floor and really saturating it, that's exactly what we wanted to see. So another immersive element, and something that's been happening at Roy's Redwoods for a long time, is this children play area. Previously, this idea of fort building and playing was common throughout Roy's Redwoods. And for us, it was not something that we wanted to see everywhere. We didn't want to see forts up all over the forest. So we demarcated an area, an exploration area. And so this area is the place where if outdoor education classes or kids want to build things, they can do it in this area. But we don't want it spread out all over the forest floor. So we have a site for it. And so our final goal was to restore and enhance the health of the redwood forest. So that included decompaction of soils. Some of these soils were really compacted, and talking to Mia Monroe from the Muir Woods Park, she said, you really got to focus on that. That was something that they learned in their revegetation efforts. So we did, and I think Julian's going to talk more about that. We implemented an understory revegetation plan, and we're fostering a stewardship program. Julian's going to talk about all these things. I just wanted to show a couple of photos of the making of mossy rocks. So this is one of the new trails. This is on the Mossy Rocks Trail, and part of the trail construction required, you see right here, this is a redwood log. This whole trail is lined with redwood logs, but it also required some boulders to hold up the trail edge. And when we built it, we weren't entirely satisfied with the aesthetics of it. It felt a little too new for this aged forest. And so we mossified the rocks. And so this was something that Julian and Asia really spearheaded. And you could probably coax him to tell him your secret recipe, but it's a personal blend that they use to adhere the moss to the rocks. And that was, I think, over a year ago at this point, and that moss is still there. And so we've since mossified, or Julian really has mossified other rocks. So this is another retaining wall with the mossification. It's so fun. Volunteers love it. And it's a really cool way to just kind of add a nice aesthetic to it and care. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Julian.
All right. All right, you guys seeing my slideshow now?
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Julian Geoghegan. I'm the vegetation specialist with Marin County Parks. Thank you very much for having me. Very happy to be back to present on one of my favorite places. So I've divided my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I'll touch on some of the flora of Roy's redwoods, the plant communities that are out there, and then go into some detail on a couple of rare plant species as well. And then for the second part of my presentation, I'll focus on the revegetation component of the restoration project that Jon just described. All right, so this is a vegetation map of the Roy's Redwood project area. And don't worry, I'm not expecting anybody to read that tiny legend at the bottom. I've just gone ahead and labeled the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm sure most of you have been out there many times, but just to orient us again, this is Nicasio Valley Road coming down the hill. The entrance, the main entrance to Roy's is right around here by the end of Nicasio. And then all of this dark green polygon is the redwood forest, which does continue up the slope to the southwest, but this is the main grove that we'll be talking about today. And I'll be showing you this map again a little later to talk about some of the other vegetation types. But the first thing I'd like to talk about is the redwood forest, because that is the main event of Roy's Redwoods Open Space Preserve. There are some really impressive and spectacular old growth trees and fairy rings out there. And they may not be the largest or the tallest or the oldest old growth redwoods, but just the fact that these trees escaped 19th and early 20th century logging is something of a miracle, given their proximity to development. There was some logging at Roy's. You can still see a few old stumps, mostly up above the forest trail. So my guess is that the trees that we see today were simply too small or too twisted or too branched to be of significant lumber value. So maybe they took the few most valuable trees and spared the remainder. So for the grove survived the logging area more or less intact and was preserved as public open space. But there are a few new threats on the horizon. And the real motive of this entire project is to protect the health of this redwood forest so that it can persist into an uncertain future. Climate change is predicted to create hotter, drier conditions, prolonged droughts, more intense storms, all of which could contribute to the decline of this ecosystem, especially when combined with the intensive recreational use that we've seen out there over the last half century or so. As Jon was talking about, this project will retain more rainfall within the grove through the hydrologic restoration. It'll decrease the soil compaction so the soil can absorb and retain more water. And it will also decrease the foot traffic through the grove, which tramples and destroys the understory vegetation, compacts the soil, damages roots, etc. So we weren't out there planting redwood trees or really doing much of anything to the existing redwoods. But I just want to emphasize that this project was really all about conserving this redwood forest. I'm sure you all know as many fun facts about redwood trees as I do. So I would rather take a moment to focus on some of the other members of this plant community out there. One of the things that really strikes me about the flora of Roy's redwoods is that the forest flora has a unique composition of species. And many of the species that you would expect to find in a redwood forest are sparse or even absent. There is very little redwood sorrel, very little redwood violet. There's no wild ginger, not a lot of huckleberries. Instead, we have abundant streamside violet, abundant enchanter's nightshade, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. Plus many of the usual redwood suspects like sword ferns, trail plants, adder's tongues, etc. But the point I'd like to make is that in thinking about this or any restoration project, we should be very thoughtful about and respectful of the plant community that is there and try to understand what's unique about it and sort of use that as our foundational knowledge to build off of as we're planning a project. So here are just a few of the other species, my favorite species from the redwood floor. Red columbines. I never really understood the connection to the Aquilegia, why it was referred to as an eagle. I always thought it looked a little bit more like a rocket ship. But then I learned that the eagle in question is actually the spurs on the top of the flower are the talons of the eagle that are clasping at its prey. So after that, it clicked and I felt a little silly, but now I appreciate it even more. On the right, fetid adder's tongue. These are in full bloom right now if you manage to get out there soon. I love that they're such early bloomers and, you know, one of the first really cool wildflowers to greet you as spring starts to come about. On the left, this is Colomia heterophylla, which wasn't one I was very familiar with until I started spending a lot of time at Roy's. It has these very tiny purple flowers and a very pungent smell. So be forewarned about that. And then on the right, the fairy bells, very prolific in the redwood understory out there, and make these really gorgeous little golden fruits. All right, so back to our vegetation map. I also wanted to touch on the bay forest plant community, which is a pretty significant part of the project area. It's this kind of grayish, brownish green polygon across the top of the project area. You know, this is a much more diverse and dynamic ecosystem compared to the redwoods, which are sort of unchanged over centuries. You know, there's lots of variety in the understory here, mostly dependent on how much light is getting through the canopy. These trees in this picture, fairly small with a bit more of an open canopy, a lot of light hitting the ground. Bays are also much faster growing trees and are also very prone to falling down, at least at Roy's Redwoods they are. At which point they'll often start sprouting along the fallen trunk like you see here, and you get these like really funny growth patterns where there's this giant trunk with like 30 new trees growing straight up. Fallen bay trees were actually also a big factor in the proliferation of social trails at Roy's Redwoods, because every time a tree fell on a social trail, it wouldn't get cleared because it's not an official trail. So then a new social trail would be created to navigate around the fallen tree. And so you would just get more and more and more social trails navigating through all these fallen bay trees. So hopefully now that we have official trails that are going to be, you know, maintained, this won't be a problem anymore. This community also has a very biodiverse understory, big swaths of Myanthemum stellatum, Fritillaria, Piperia, like you see here, lots of Yerba Buena, Douglas iris, on and on. There is also a lot of poison oak there, so be forewarned if you want to go exploring the bay forest at Roy's Redwoods. Might be a bad idea. The third and final plant community I wanted to point out here is this little medley of freshwater wetlands that's kind of just inside the main gate. Most people probably don't even notice it because they're all looking at the redwood trees. But I find it very cool and very interesting. There's this stand of royal willow over here, and then a swath of brown-headed rush, which is this bright green part. California blackberry over on the right, which extends quite a distance to the south. Some patches of water parsley, Enanthe sarmentosa, which is kind of an unusual one for us. And I think the significance here is that this really emphasizes the botanical diversity of the site and also the habitat diversity of the site. You know, these wetlands are a great habitat for different species of amphibians, different species of birds, other creatures, And I just find it really cool that we have all of these different native plant communities kind of squished into this really cool small space. All right, so there are a couple of plant species that I'd like to discuss due to their rarity. The first is Circia alpina subspecies pacifica, aka small enchanter's nightshade, which is not in fact a nightshade at all, but is a member of Onograceae, the evening primrose family. It's a very small herbaceous plant, grows about a foot or so tall, has an inflorescence of very small white flowers, which each have 2 sepals and 2 divided petals, which is a pretty unusual flower arrangement. You will need a hand lens to get a closer look at those. They're perennial and they reproduce by seed, but also vegetatively through rhizomes and stolons. And then they also make these little underground tubers, so they can kind of do everything, which is neat. And where this species gets interesting is when we look at its distribution map. It's actually a very widespread species, not just in California, but across Western North America. Grows throughout Northwestern California, the Sierra Nevada, all the way down to the transverse ranges down by LA. There's a few scattered sites in the coast ranges. And then there's this little blip here in Marin County, which, zooming in on this inset map here, goes from Roy's Redwoods through Samuel P. Taylor, also old growth redwood forest, over Bolinas Ridge, down into like the Five Brooks area along the Highway 1. So this species is not an endangered species. It's not in the CNPS rare plant inventory, but it is significant on a local level as an outlier, isolated population of this much more widespread species, especially because it's so characteristic of the Roy's Redwoods plant community, but is largely absent from the rest of the county. So here we're zooming back into Roy's Redwoods. The yellow polygons on this map show the distribution of the Circia within the preserve. And as far as I'm aware, it's pretty much restricted to the project area. It's not really growing on the steep slope up above. So you can see it's quite widespread throughout the redwood grove, and in particular in those areas that historically have gotten pretty light foot traffic. That big polygon on the right side there, that's kind of tucked away in the corner. Not a whole lot of people make it all the way back there. Here's a picture from that area showing these dense patches of Circia. But you can also see that this social trail is cutting right through it. This species is very susceptible to trampling. They have very delicate stems. They really can't take much foot traffic at all. So this project should help conserve this species in a couple of ways. One, by reducing that trampling pressure by getting at least most of the hikers up onto the official trails. And then also by outplanting Circia as part of our revegetation effort, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right, but first I wanted to go over another rare species. This is Lysingea hololuca, or woolly-headed Lysingea. This is a California rare plant rank 3 species, which is the review list. So it is in the CNPS rare plant inventory. It's an annual member of Asteraceae with these very pretty pinkish, purplish inflorescences. I'm sure there's a word for that color, but I don't know what it is. Grayish green leaves and stems, grows a couple feet tall, usually 1 or 2 feet. And at Roy's, it's growing along the Loop Trail, which is up on the slope north of the Redwood Grove. So we're looking at this bright pink polygon here that's sort of crossing into the project area. And when I say along the trail, I really mean in the trail. In this picture, you can kind of barely make out these kind of pinkish purplish tufts of Lysingea right on the margins of the trail in these braided sections in between, like inside the trail, as well as in like drainage features, like water drainage features that the county maintains. So counterintuitively, and in contrast to our friend the Cercea, this rare plant appears to be entirely dependent on the disturbed conditions created by trampling. And without that impact, the Lysingea would likely get outcompeted by other species. So this creates something of a conservation conundrum, in my opinion, where removing a disturbance would likely result in the decline of a rare native species. So we had to put a lot of thought into how we could reconfigure this trail connection without reducing the Lysingea habitat or causing unnecessary additional impacts to the rest of this adjacent grassland, which is actually a pretty nice grassland. And eventually we came up with something that I think will work. And in fact, that beautiful stone staircase that Jon showed you earlier in his presentation was created pretty much exclusively to avoid impacts to the Lysingea. And another part of that solution was to collect Lysingea's seed from this site and then to amplify it, meaning that we grew Lysingea from seed at our nursery and then collected seed from those propagated plants. So we're essentially taking a small amount of wild seed and turning it into a large amount of propagated seed. And then we used that seed to sow in a newly constructed portion of trail that is contiguous with the original population of Lysingea. So our hope is that we're actually going to end up with more Lysingea habitat than we started with. We'll keep an eye on this. I feel like this is going to be one of the more unpredictable variables in our conservation efforts out here. But we will keep a close eye and see what happens. All right, so at this point, I'd like to switch gears and start talking about the revegetation part of the restoration project. And I think that this map that we're looking at now is a good place to start. So this is the exact same view of the project area that we've been looking at with the vegetation map. But this version shows the pre-project conditions. So the thick orange lines were the official roads and trails. So you can see there weren't that many of them within the project area. The thin red lines were the social trails, or at least the main social trails. There were definitely a lot more than what's shown here. I think Jon had a better version of that data. And then the pink crosshatched polygons show the heavily trampled areas, or as this map refers to them as the heavy visitor use areas. But you know, for our purposes, trampled areas is kind of a better description of what we're trying to address. So here's that picture. The lawns had essentially been trampled into dust. There were redwood trees, obviously, but then just bare dirt with very little other vegetation growing. In this picture, you can see this exposed redwood root with a few polypody ferns or maybe goldback ferns hiding out under the root, sheltering from the foot traffic. So we wanted to revegetate these places to restore the ecosystem, but also to just get them looking more natural again, in the hope that that will then discourage visitors from walking around in there in the future, and just having it revert back to being packed earth like it was before. So these areas were the most in need of restoration and revegetation. But one of the challenges is that the soil here had become very compacted by decades of foot traffic. You know, you look at any hard packed trail surface. That's essentially what this entire area was. So the first step was to try and undo some of that compaction, essentially trying to get some air into the soil so that it could absorb water, and then plant roots could, more easily travel through the soil. This was done primarily with a tool called an air spade, which is kind of like a lance-shaped tool that shoots a high-powered stream of compressed air, which breaks up the soil, but does very minimal damage to any roots that it comes in contact with. All right, so we used a few different revegetation methods for this project, one of which was plant salvage. This is the practice of digging up existing vegetation and then replanting it elsewhere. And in particular, we were focused on salvaging Western sword fern along the route of the new forest trail, which kind of follows the southern edge of the project area right along the toe of the slope. So my team worked very closely with the trail crew to identify every fern that was in the corridor of the new trail. And then we carefully dug them out and then potted them up in these felt bags. You can see Steve carrying one on his back there. We brought them back to a space at our nursery that we termed Fernlandia, which was this kind of like shambling shade structure that we kind of built ad hoc. We kept them well watered there for the next year or so until it was time to plant them back out. And we ended up salvaging about 375 bags of ferns, and each bag had probably 2 or 3 ferns on it, depending on how big the bag was. So we're probably upwards of 800 or so sword ferns altogether. And ferns are very tough plants. I don't think we lost a single one over the course of the project. So they did very well in their sojourn at the nursery. We did also salvage some Cercia plants as well. But it turns out that that species is very easy to propagate from seed, which is probably a more efficient way to go about it. So that was a lesson learned. Sword ferns, on the other hand, very difficult to propagate from spores, take a very long time to grow to a large size. So, trying to go out and buy a bunch of locally sourced Roy's redwood sword ferns was not really an option. So this ended up being like a really effective way to go about restoring those heavily trampled areas that I pointed out, because we were able to just drop hundreds of mature sword ferns into the planting areas, just totally transform them. If anybody here has done any kind of restoration planting before, oftentimes you're planting like little tiny baby plants in little plugs. And after you plant them out, you can barely even notice them. But when you're planting a sword fern with a 3-foot wingspan, most people will look at it and just assume it's been there for years. Here's a volunteer putting in some sword ferns. There's the fern mobile arriving. All right, so we also grew many container plants for this project. Over 7,000 all told, grown at our nursery by Asia in San Rafael, and also under contract with the Watershed Nursery over across the bridge in Richmond. All of these plants were grown from locally collected seed, much of which came from Roy's Redwoods Open Space Preserve. And then once the rains started in earnest in December, we started getting plants in the ground. Here's a list of, more or less complete list of the plants that we propagated for this season. It was a really huge task to get all of these plants in the ground, plus all of the ferns. Luckily, we had the support of some really awesome, really amazing volunteers who were out there, like some of them every week, sometimes multiple times a week. They're super fun to work with, and it was really rewarding to see the landscape just transforming over the course of a few weeks. So here's our, you've seen this picture 3 times now, but here's our before picture. This is the same spot from a slightly different angle. And I think like you give this area a few months for those container plants to grow in, and you probably won't even be able to tell that it was a planted area. One really nice thing about planting in a redwood understory is it's very cool and very shady and very damp. And it's just like a very forgiving environment for container plants, compared to, you know, planting in a dry grassland or something like that. So I think we're going to get pretty good survivorship in these areas. Oh, there's a picture of Colleen. I think I meant to take this slide out, but I accidentally left it in. So there's a picture of Colleen enjoying planting in an atmospheric river. Here is another planting area over by the forest trail. So this is essentially that same site I just showed you, but from the other side. So this was all just like bare packed dirt prior to planting. We also planted quite a few wetland species, lots of juncus, carex, water parsley. So this is kind of near the boardwalk, the main boardwalk, planting a bunch of juncus in this, what will hopefully become a freshwater wetland. All right, so the final part of this project that I wanted to talk to you about tonight is the restoration of Roy's Meadow. Many of you probably been there, but just to sort of orient everyone again, it's that big grassy clearing essentially in the middle of the project area. So if you go in the main gate and take a left, the trail used to run right through the middle of the meadow. And the meadow is like a really cool place. I think, you know, because it can be hard to appreciate how tall a redwood tree is when you're in a redwood forest, because most of the time the tops of all the trees are blocked from view by all the other trees. So the meadow gives you that view of the old growth grove. And I think it's a pretty special spot to a lot of people. But if anywhere at Roy's had been loved to death, the meadow is it. You know, the redwood forest, the bay forest, the freshwater wetlands, they're all pretty resistant to invasive plant species. You might find the occasional like Himalayan blackberry or English ivy hiding out somewhere. But invasive cover is basically zero within those plant communities. The same cannot be said for California grasslands. And this grassland in particular, there was like a couple coyote brush and like one or two Danthonia hiding out. But it was essentially 100% invasive plants. Here's a picture of what it looked like before pre-project. On the left, this is a monoculture of Arenatheron eladeus, tall oak grass, which is a perennial bunch grass. It's actually a pretty uncommon weed in Marin County. I can't really think of anywhere else where it's this abundant. And the urban legend goes that there used to be a lot of weddings in the meadow. And on one occasion, someone was scattering grain ahead of the bride, which just happened to be tall oak grass seed. I don't know if that's true, but I'm happy to spread the myth to all of you, unless one of you told it to me. On the right is mostly annual grasses like Sanisurus, Lolium, Avena, etc. You can really see the difference in the color. It's kind of interesting. And this was like a sad thing, but it was also convenient in one way, in that we felt very comfortable using the meadow as a staging area during the construction project. We probably would not have felt that way if there was significant native grass cover in the meadow. So John showed you some pictures of it full of logs. I think this is after most of the logs had been put in. But after the project was, or after the construction part of the project was completed, we needed to decide what to do to remediate the meadow. After all the materials and the equipment had been moved out, what are we going to do with it? The idea we had going in was simply to regrade the meadow and then just kind of let it grass back over with whatever weed species were already present. And in a couple of years, it would probably just be back to the way it was before, essentially. This area was never really the focus of the project. That was the redwood grove. But in the end, we kind of realized that this was like a really unique opportunity to try and do something a little bit more ambitious. We had the equipment there, we had the people there, we had the funding to do it. And if we didn't restore the meadow now at this point, when it looked like this, it's probably never going to happen, especially after the road to the meadow was taken out as part of the construction project. So by this point in history, it had been many, many decades since this place was a native grassland. I've been told that prior to becoming an open space preserve, the meadow was heavily grazed by cattle. It was mostly just thistle at that point. So we didn't think there would be much of a native seed bank to work with. So we basically needed to start from scratch. And the first step to do that was to try to reduce that invasive grass seed bank. So to that end, we dug a very big hole in the middle of the meadow and then pushed as much of that weed contaminated topsoil as we could into the hole, and then we buried it. So I'm sure that there are still plenty of weed seeds mixed in on the top of the meadow. We definitely didn't get all of them. It's not the way weeds work. But hopefully we kind of knocked that seed bank back a little bit to give the natives a chance to grow. So the next step was to regrade the meadow. And when they regraded it, they did it in such a way that it's no longer flat. There's actually some undulations to it, which are a little bit hard to see in this picture. But you would, if you were walking along the meadow, you'd be kind of going up and down. And the idea is that those undulations will channel water across the meadow and into the redwoods, whereas before the water was running down the meadow trail right into the creek and then, kind of flushing out the bottom of the redwood grove. So that should hopefully help with the hydrology. The soil also needed to be decompacted, just like it did within the redwood grove. But because this was like a wide open area without any trees, they were able to just use the heavy machinery to do that, which was a lot less work than the air spade. So you can kind of see these perpendicular grooves going through the meadow. You can still see them if you go out there this spring, and that's from the decompaction process. So next came the fun part, where we hydro-seeded over 90 pounds of native seed across the entire meadow. You can see the list on the right there. There's about 2/3 by weight of native grass seed and about 1/3 native forbs. Most of these forbs are disturbance adapted annual species, so they grow fast, they grow in disturbed ground, they grow in poor soil. And the idea with that is that these species will germinate quickly and then hopefully compete with any weeds that come up and kind of hold that space until the slower growing perennial grasses can fill in. At least that's my theory. We'll see how it goes. And here is what it's looking like as of last week. We have lots of germination. A lot of those forb species, like the poppies and the lupins, are already identifiable. The fiddlenecks are even starting to flower. So we got our first wildflowers out there. So I'm very pleased with that. It's a little harder to tell with the grass seedlings. We'll have to wait a little longer to see how that shakes out, but I am hopeful. But the thing that I do want to stress about this meadow restoration is that we're really not going for perfection here. You know, we're not looking for 100% native cover. You know, even if we ended up with like 50% native invasive cover, that's still a huge improvement over what it was before, which was like less than 1% native cover. Nor are we intending to do a lot of intensive invasive plant species management in the meadow. You know, we're looking at this as more of an experiment and sort of taking this one big action at the right point in time, seeing how it plays out. And hopefully we can learn something from it that we can then apply to further projects down the road. You know, personally, this is one of the things that I'm most excited about because it's not something that I've ever done before, and it's kind of new and exciting for me. Yeah, so that pretty much wraps up my presentation. As John said, we are going to continue to steward this site into the future. We're already making our plans for next winter's planting. We're hoping to do another 8,000 container plants this coming winter. You know, especially looking to diversify the plant palette and add some additional species that we weren't able to propagate for this year. But with that, thank you so much for your time, and we are happy to answer any questions or hear any comments.
Thank you both very much. It's a wonderful project. And let's see, I think there are a few questions in the chat. No, somebody who couldn't see her slides. I hope that got solved. Hi, Julian, your meadow, this is from Sandy Pearson. Your meadow project is exciting, but without maintenance, won't the invasives just reinvade?
I didn't say no maintenance. I said no intensive invasive plant species management. Like, we're not going to be out there pulling every weed that pops up. It could be that like additional seeding is something we could do, or timed mowing to knock back certain invasive plants that are showing up. So I wouldn't say no maintenance, but we're trying to avoid getting bogged down in very labor intensive, very expensive maintenance. And, you know, like I said, it is an experiment, and I'm very hopeful that something good comes of it. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
I was curious to see that Bromus carinatus wasn't on the list of grasses. Was there a reason for that? I know it's a pretty aggressive one.
Yeah, that's one. I've had that question a few times, actually. And my answer is that it's not one that I see a lot of in the native grasslands outside of serpentine.
Oh, interesting. Because it's the most common grass in the sunnier areas of my property in Lagunitas, just up Lagunitas Road, where it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something we could add into the mix at some point.
It's certainly
there was I was
grass.
sort of using a reference site that if you go up Dixon Fire Road, which is the fire road at Roy's Redwoods,
Yeah.
go up that fire road all the way to where it leaves the preserve. Down on your left, there's this really cool native grassland. And I was sort of using that as my reference site, which is sort of the closest native grassland that was sort of reminiscent of what we were going for. So the species list that I used was somewhat based on that site.
And where did you source the seed from, since you didn't have a native supply at hand?
We got it from a few different places. We collected a lot of it. We purchased some of it from Larner Seeds in Bolinas, and we also purchased some from Hedgerow Farms, which is an operation based out of Winters that grows native grass seed from local ecotypes. And we had to be a little bit more flexible there than we would have liked. We couldn't get everything from Marin County, but we sort of used like a 1 county radius for some of the species that we couldn't get super local. So yeah, that was a concession that we decided was worth making.
But definitely a big improvement over what was there. And then next question was Rob Katz wondering if there was any California nutmeg on the property.
I've never seen any there. No.
It was up in Samuel P. Taylor, but
Yeah, I think there may be some across the way at Gary Giacomini Open Space Preserve, but I have not noticed any at Roy's. Could be there, hiding out.
Kristen, there was one question above that about is there a goal to keep people out of the meadow? And I'd say that is our goal and our hope. We have a rope fence that's somewhat temporary, but we are also leaning on the fact that we made the new trail on the edge of the meadow very gentle and accessible and comfortable. And so far that has worked well to incentivize people to stay on that trail. Like Julian was saying, that if you were to walk through the meadow, it undulates. And so it's kind of the path of least resistance to just stay on the trail. So we're going to monitor that. We would like people to stay out of the meadow.
And what plants do you plan on planting this coming winter?
We're still going to plant a lot of the violet and the cercia. Some of the species that we're hoping to kind of add into the palette, Clintonia, fringe cups. There's a scattering of fringe cups throughout Roy's Redwoods that is like a really cool species that is supposedly fairly easy to propagate. So that's one that I'd really like to get going. Vancouveria, the inside out flower. I was talking to our naturalist Shannon, and she said that she had seen it there in the past, but hasn't seen it in years. So that would be a kind of a cool like reintroduction. What else? We grew some myanthemum to plant out this year, but when we went to plant them, they were very underdeveloped. So we didn't end up planting most of them. So I'm hoping that another year for them, we'll get them big enough to plant
Stellatum?
out. Yes.
Julian, wouldn't you say there's a bit of adaptive management where we kind of want to see what does well and maybe think about future plantings?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, thank you, John. We're gonna see what's needed as well. Like if there are certain areas that are getting impacted by foot traffic, are there certain shrubs that we might grow to plant there? Or if there are certain species that are doing well, maybe we should grow more of those. And if there are some that seem like they're struggling, maybe we don't grow as many of those. One species that just came to mind is Elamis californicus. Every time I drive out to Roy's from San Rafael, I go out Lucas Valley Road.
Yes.
And if you're going towards Roy's, you go over the pass, and then as you're coming down on your left, there's a patch of Elamis californicus that's like hanging over the road. And every time I go by, I'm like, oh, we should grow some of that to plant out there. That would be cool. Rare grass.
There's some right above San Geronimo Creek at Mountain View, where it comes off of Sir Francis Drake in Lagunitas. It's right.
So it's
so
like very
there. It's there.
I wouldn't feel too bad about introducing it, even though it's never been there.
I think it probably was there historically.
Exactly.
John Murray asks, where can others see this presentation? It's being recorded and it will be posted on our chapter's YouTube channel. And thank you for preserving the Lysyngia. That was from Clint Kellner. You guys did great work, wonderful project. Larson Creek seems too ephemeral to support the larval Pacific giant salamanders. Where do you think they breed? And then they would have to migrate back to Roy's Redwoods.
We don't know where they breed. My assumption is on site, but we don't know where for sure.
Yeah, I was reading about them. Maybe it was in Bay Nature, and that there's a little mystery about about their life history. Lisa Wolcott asks if there's a link for volunteer opportunities for this project, propagation or out planting.
The plants have largely, we will be volunteer opportunities at our nursery. So if folks want to get involved that way. And then moving forward, there will be more stewardship of this site. And you can contact me or Julian, and we can connect. We would connect you with Greg Riza. If you know Greg Riza, he's the contact. But if you don't have his contact, I can get it to you.
Yeah, we do have a fairly narrow planting window because we want to wait until the ground is pretty saturated, but then we want to get everything in the ground early enough so that it stops raining, like now. Things will have enough water to persevere through the summer. Whereas if you plant out things a little bit too late in the spring, they might not make it.
Right, we're just getting to the end of that window now,
Exactly, yeah.
I think. The Kellners ask, would sword fern survive if it were divided prior to planting?
Yes, definitely. And we did do a little bit of that. If ferns were kind of starting to come apart into different segments, we would separate them and plant them in a 2-for-1 deal. But we weren't being too aggressive about it. There was some idea, well, we could just like cut them all in half and then we'd have twice as many ferns, which probably would have worked, but I was just too nervous about like stressing them out more after their ordeal. So we were a little conservative about that.
Yeah, and it's also more naturalistic to have a range of sizes, to have some mature.
Yeah, right.
Such a fabulous project, incredible effort by Marin County Parks and its devoted volunteers. My family recently visited the Redwoods and were blown away by the thought and care put into the planning and execution. Are you going to plant any redwoods?
I don't think there's any plans to do that.
You mentioned ranching, but what were the impacts of the commune that was once there? Ooh.
Yeah, Roy's Redwoods has a storied past, and if folks didn't know, there was a commune and folks living in the redwood forest. I think it was back in the 60s, but there were a lot of impacts. The meadow that Julian talked all about, the restoration. I mean, there used to be a road that went right to that meadow, and that road is no more. So you can no longer drive into the preserve. So we're really trying to peel the onion back of all these decades of impacts. I don't know specifically what the commune did, but I'm sure they had their place as well.
Yeah, if anybody has any anecdotes or insider information about the history of Roy's, I would love to hear your stories too. I'm always gathering information about the sites. So
early pictures would be great. Great project and presentation. Really enjoyed visiting recently. Do you have plant and animal lists available to download?
Well, I mostly use the CMPS list for Roy's. So
you're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that we could add to it, but it's pretty much got everything you need. Animal wise, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think we have an animal list.
I should start one. How old do you think the oldest redwoods in the park are?
So there were some researchers that were doing canopy studies at Roy's several years back, and they did core samples on some of the larger trees, and their estimates were around 360 years old. So assuming that the largest were some of the oldest, that's our best guess.
Mm-hmm. What is the mossing technique?
We tried a couple of different methods. One of them was the fabled buttermilk method, where you kind of blend it up with buttermilk and then spread it on. I don't really know what the buttermilk is supposed to do, but it seemed to work okay.
Magic.
Another method that we tried, which kind of had more instant results, was to try and just like peel off a sheet of moss off like a fallen log, and then use some, and then press, especially, it had more of an instant gratification to it.
I'd imagine if the sheet was sort of propped up at one edge, so it couldn't just slip off, that would probably help too.
Yeah, I mean, we were mostly trying to do it on like the flat horizontal surfaces, and then hope that they kind of like grow down onto the vertical surfaces.
And Larry Bathgate asks, are you going to be planting any Phacelia? Californica probably occurs on site up in the drier.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could put a few in the meadow and see how they do, like along in the sunnier parts.
They'll get choked out by the beefier grasses, but they're often around rock outcroppings and places where they're.
Yeah, well, that's why I thought, because the trail through there has those big rocks that they use to make the trail. Like maybe we could like put some in there or something. I'd give it a shot.
Yeah, they're very easy and quick from seed. Amazing. Did you find much evidence of some of the other plants, such as Eurybia radulina? That's that woodland aster.
Not down there, no.
It's all over my property under the redwoods here and firs here in Lagunitas.
Really?
So, yeah. So if you want seed from here, you're welcome to come.
I kind of associate it more with kind of
houndstone.
Yeah,
houndstone.
Well. Definitely a lot of houndstone out there, but I haven't seen any Eurybia, or at least I can't remember seeing any.
It's modest.
Entirely possible that I did.
And it doesn't bloom until about July. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I think.
Oh, Doreen says she has photos of it.
Oh, Doreen says she has photos of it at Royce Redwoods. There you go.
That could be another a reintroduction with our Vancouver area.
Definitely. Okay, I think that's the last of the questions. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask verbally, they can unmute themselves, raise their hand, maybe. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you both so much, and we're hoping to get a field trip from you guys later in spring.
Yeah, that would be great. We would love that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yay. And so thank you both. And our April program is, find my notes here. Is Eric Shoes, spelled SHOOHS, of Sonoma Ecology Center on landscaping with fire resilient California natives. His work has mostly been up in Sonoma County on larger properties, but we expect many of the same practices would be helpful on smaller sites as well. So hope to see you all in April, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.